They didn't question him, they dismissed him. From the moment he walked through the doors, the looks began. One glance at his skin, and it didn't matter what he carried, what he wore, or how he spoke. A black man in a place built for wealth and whiteness was not just out of place, he was a threat. They pulled him aside without reason. They made him wait where no one else waited. They spoke over him, around him, but never to him. A manager smirked about his hands. Another called security without a word. No one asked who he was, they decided. And in their eyes, he was just another mistake that needed correcting. But what they didn't know, what would tear through their perfect glass walls and polished reputations, was the truth they were too blind to see. Because the man they tried to humiliate wasn't just anybody. And when this was over, every assumption they made would come back like a thunderclap. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about reckoning. If this hit you, don't scroll past. Like, subscribe, and join the conversation. Where are you watching from? What moment made you stop and think? Drop it below. Your voice matters here. The late morning sun bounced off the glass facade of Hallberg and Trenton Private Banking, a glimmering tower of status in the center of financial district pride. Everything about it radiated intentional separation, the marble flooring, the subtle notes of eucalyptus circulating through the air vents, the sleek reception counters staffed with people who didn't smile, just nodded. It wasn't a place for casual banking. It was a place for those who didn't ask for credit checks because they never needed credit. Omari Ellington stepped through the entrance wearing a clean but modest blazer, shoes that had walked years but still held polish, and a wristwatch that told time precisely but didn't flash a brand. He held a single folder in his left hand and moved with the kind of deliberate calmness people use when they know they'll be judged before they speak. Before he could reach the welcome desk, a man stepped directly into his path. His suit was immaculate navy, cut by a hand that knew power, and his eyes scanned Omari like he was scanning for an error. Doyle Whitaker, Regional Director, nameplate glinting like it wanted to be read. Sir, this entrance is reserved for Wealth Suite clientele. If you're here for general services, please check the directory at the 9th Street side. His tone was smooth but sharp, honed over years of trimming down those who didn't meet the unspoken code of entry. Omari held out his appointment confirmation with his name and Doyle's printed clearly at the top. Doyle didn't look at the paper. Instead, his eyes dropped to Omari's shoes, creased, worn near the toe. Then the watch, metal scuffed, not decorative. He turned slightly toward a junior receptionist, keeping his voice low but loud enough for Omari to hear. Wrong delivery, he said, lips tightening. Probably meant for prepaid services. Someone needs to recheck these auto-confirm links. The receptionist hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, but said nothing. Omari's arm lowered. The weight of the room settled into his skin. Nobody said a word. Nobody welcomed him. Nobody moved to correct Doyle. There was only quiet, and that quiet said everything. After a beat, Omari responded, "I have a confirmed appointment." Doyle glanced briefly at the paper, then back at Omari, eyes narrowing slightly. "Ellington," he muttered. "One moment." He walked away without another word. Omari remained standing, feeling every sideways glance, every half-second stare, every internal calculation happening across the room. A client in a charcoal suit shifted in his chair. A woman adjusted her bag closer to her lap. Even the security guard drifted half a step closer, not overt, just near enough. 3 minutes passed before Doyle returned and said curtly, "This way." No apology, no courtesy, just control. Omari followed, past framed photographs of smiling founders, past walls that didn't echo. Through a door marked Suite 3, Doyle gestured toward a basic guest chair, lower back, shallower padding, not the kind offered to typical high-net-worth clients. Doyle sat opposite, behind a desk of dark oak, and opened a silver laptop. No handshake, no welcome, just keys clicking. Finally, he looked up. "You're here about a trust, correct?" Unusual balance, history triggered a review. "My team flagged it." Omari replied with a single nod. Doyle tapped on the keys again. "And your relationship to the trust?" "Beneficiary." Sole beneficiary. Doyle paused. That so? Not disbelief, dismissal. He didn't lean in, didn't probe. Just cataloged the response and moved on like it was a mistake soon to be corrected. He picked up the desk phone and mumbled a request for verification and full trace. A woman from another department entered moments later. Doyle handed her a folder and spoke without glancing at Omari. Verify everything. Documentation, wire origins, employment history. When she left, the door clicked just slightly louder than it needed to. His voice was professional, clinical, yet layered with just enough pause and emphasis to twist procedure into something pointed. Omari rose from his seat without a word. He knew better than to argue, not yet. He followed Doyle back through the glass hallway, where passing associates offered nods to the director, but avoided Omari's gaze entirely. The room they entered wasn't much more than a holding bay, an auxiliary corner with a few mismatched chairs, a rust-colored carpet that didn't quite match the bank's polished aesthetic, and a table with a stack of outdated finance magazines. Doyle turned to the junior receptionist, who was now back behind the front desk. "There's something off in here," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Do we have someone who can check the ventilation system?" Smells like a burnt cologne bottle exploded near the wall. Several clients in the lobby looked up from their tablets, some glancing toward Omari, others pretending not to listen, but shifting uncomfortably. The receptionist blinked, unsure how to respond, but picked up the phone and began dialing building maintenance. Omari, hearing every syllable, kept his posture straight and his face still. Inside, something stirred, but he buried it deep. He had trained himself over years not to react when dignity was scraped away in pieces rather than in slaps. Doyle gestured toward one of the chairs by the wall, worn steel frame, cracked vinyl padding, and positioned next to a small hallway leading to the restrooms. It was the kind of chair placed not for comfort, but containment. Across the lobby, leather seats cradled high-paying clients as they sipped mint-infused water, flipping through investor briefings printed on thick matte stock. One even had a monogrammed blanket draped across the armrest. As Omari sat, the contrast hit him like static, small but constant. Two receptionists passed by and spoke in hushed tones just outside his periphery. One of them glanced in his direction and quickly looked away, as if making eye contact might invite a problem. Omari's file sat unopened on his lap. He didn't check his phone. He didn't shift in his seat. He just sat. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. The lobby continued to buzz with movement. Heels on marble, digital signatures on tablets, the polite murmur of elite appointments being ushered in and out. But around Omari, the air felt like glass, transparent, fragile, and cold. A man in an expensive three-piece suit passed in front of him, trailing a subtle cloud of vetiver cologne. The man paused briefly as if to ask a question, then noticed Omari's presence and thought better of it, turning sharply toward the main reception instead. The whisper of assumption followed him like perfume. Near the far end of the lobby, a concierge brought a tray of drinks to a waiting couple, sparkling water with lime wheels balanced delicately on the rim. They laughed softly, unaware or unconcerned with the quiet fracture happening just a few yards away. Doyle reemerged from behind the glass doors, now speaking animatedly to another associate. As he passed Omari, he let his voice rise again, this time adding a subtle grimace as he motioned toward the holding area. "Make sure facilities gives this section a full wipe down," he said. "There's something clinging in here, not sure if it's the carpet or something else." His sentence trailed just long enough for imagination to fill in the rest. Omari felt the heat creep up his spine, but didn't move. He didn't blink. He'd learned the difference between responding and retaliating. Responding invited resistance. Retaliating sealed judgment. The receptionist nodded and scribbled something on a clipboard without looking at him. A cleaning staff member emerged from a side hallway holding a spray bottle and a rag. She didn't speak. She looked at Omari, then looked away, then began spritzing the edge of the glass partition not 5 feet from his seat. No one asked him to move. That would be too obvious. But they cleaned around him, not with him in mind, but as if he were residue that needed containment. Another associate walked past carrying a bundle of investor portfolios. She didn't pause, but Omari noticed the slight lift in her nostrils as she passed him, as though she expected to smell something different, something lesser. The back of his throat tightened, but he held it. Doyle's voice rang out again, now across the room, joking with someone from operations. Omari caught just a fragment: client experience, high net worth, selective partnerships. Every word crafted not for function, but for exclusion. Someone behind the reception counter said quietly, "I thought only executive-level clients came through this entrance." The other replied under their breath, "Maybe he's lost. Maybe he's delivering documents for someone." Omari heard them. Every word, every assumption. His folder still sat, untouched. The paper inside felt heavier now, not from weight, but from pressure. Like each sheet carried the burden of justifying his presence. Time passed. He didn't check how much. It moved like fog, slow and obscuring. Finally, the woman from compliance returned, walking with purpose, but without urgency. She didn't speak to Omari. She spoke to Doyle first, whispering in his ear. Behind Doyle, a framed certificate from the American Trust Council gleamed on the wall, positioned just high enough to force anyone looking at it to glance up. It was the kind of placement that declared importance without modesty. Omari adjusted the folder in his lap as Doyle finally reopened his laptop, muttering just audible enough. "All right then, let's see what we're dealing with." The screen's glow reflected off his glasses as his eyes scanned line after line of data. His expression shifted gradually, from annoyance to disbelief to something harder to name. He clicked several times, then leaned back. "You understand this is unusual," he said flatly. "A trust of this size, structured with a single beneficiary, no legal advisory attached, and no recent transaction logs to trace public income?" He didn't wait for an answer. This sort of thing, in this climate, tends to attract the wrong kind of attention. Omari sat still. His eyes did not shift. Doyle turned to his phone and dialed an internal extension. A short pause. "Hey, it's Doyle. I need Tier 3 protocols on a flagged account. Ellington Omari. Yes, yellow. Apparently he's the sole beneficiary of a high-value trust with zero prior visibility. Full breakdown, including legal origin, last 5 transfers, foreign routing. I want eyes on Cayman, Monaco, and Singapore." He ended the call with a curt tap and didn't bother explaining further. Omari stared at the framed certificate again. In the corner of the glass, his reflection looked distant, almost blurred. The silence dragged. After a few minutes, a woman from compliance entered carrying a printout and a notepad. She was young, sharp-featured, and walked quickly but not nervously. Her eyes met Doyle's but never Omari's. She handed him the document, and he reviewed it without acknowledgement. Then, as if remembering the person sitting across from him, Doyle asked, "Do you happen to have documentation on the origin of these assets?" Omari responded with a calm nod, opened his folder, and slid forward a single sheet, letterhead embossed, signature clear, notarized in Los Angeles County. Doyle took it with a deliberate slowness. He didn't read it. Not right away. Instead, he tilted it under the desk light, scrutinizing the watermark. Then he set it aside and continued reading the report. Beside him, the compliance officer leaned slightly to whisper something in his ear. Doyle's eyes didn't leave the screen, but he chuckled under his breath. Omari couldn't hear the exact words, but he caught the rhythm of it, the suggestion, the assumption. A man like him, with an account like this, in a building like this. The story wrote itself. When Doyle finally looked up, his tone was even more clinical. "I'll be frank with you, Mr. Ellington. We've seen similar structures used to disguise laundering channels for overseas assets. Oil money, crypto holdings, shell corporations built off black market commodities. The fact that your records contain no standard reporting trail raises more than one concern." He paused, leaning forward. "Have you ever been involved in international transfers that weren't declared to the IRS?" Omari's response came slow and clear. "No, never." Doyle did not nod. He only resumed typing. The keyboard clicks sounded louder now, like quiet accusations. Outside the suite, another employee passed the window. Omari saw her glance inside, do a subtle double-take, and then disappear around the corner. He imagined the conversation forming in hushed tones down the hallway. Doesn't look like the usual clientele. Must be a mistake, probably flagged for review. The folder Doyle had just read from now lay flat beside his laptop. One edge curled slightly from the tension of being held too long. The compliance officer checked her notes, then murmured again, too low for Omari to hear. But Doyle gave a soft hum of agreement. He finally looked up. There's also a discrepancy in your last residential record. Your previous mailing address was a P.O. box in Baldwin Hills. That's not uncommon, but for a trust of this nature, it's unconventional. Omari met his stare. It was the look of a man who'd had to justify every upward step he'd taken. Baldwin Hills is where I grew up. The trust was activated after I turned 28. The box was kept for legal continuity. Doyle made a small sound in the back of his throat. Of course. He said it like the answer made everything worse. I think we'll need to bring in our legal analyst, he continued. Just protocol. We can't release or even formally recognize the trust until we're confident everything passes KYC threshold. Know your client. A phrase Omari had heard 1,000 times in corporate meetings, always uttered when someone wanted a polite reason to push someone out. He nodded slowly. Understood. Doyle reached for the phone again. While we wait, I'll also request financial vetting for all related partners or affiliations. It may take an hour, perhaps longer. When Doyle returned, he did so with two new figures. One wore a gray suit with a red lanyard, holding a manila folder tight to her chest. The other wore a darker suit, no lanyard, but had an earpiece curled behind his left ear and shoes that clicked with authority. Omari recognized the posture immediately. Security. Discreet but present. Doyle gestured toward the seat and cleared his throat before speaking in that same lawyer's rhythm. Mr. Ellington, in order to proceed with institutional-level verification, we're going to need a decade-long employment history. Roles, companies, tenure dates, supervisory contacts. You'll also need to supply any relevant tax records, nonprofit affiliations, and detailed explanation of your relationship to the originating parties of the trust. He paused for just a second, then added, we also require a clear statement of how and why you were designated as sole beneficiary. The words landed like numbered charges being read aloud. Omari inhaled slowly. He nodded once. Then he reached into his folder, unfolded a typed sheet, and handed it to the woman with the red lanyard. She took it wordlessly, scanned the page, then passed it across to Doyle. Omari had anticipated the question. He had lived his life with this question circling his back. How did you get here? How did you earn this? What loophole did you find? The statement he prepared was factual. It listed the companies he'd worked for. It noted how he'd spent his early career in high-pressure consulting, then pivoted into product development, finally co-founding a logistics platform that scaled during the pandemic. It mentioned no awards, no accolades, just work. Doyle read it, lips tightening, then glanced at the woman. She nodded stiffly. Still, it wasn't enough. The man in the dark suit took a single step closer, not threatening, but unmistakably intentional. Doyle gestured to the door and murmured something unintelligible. A moment later, a second guard appeared outside the room. Omari was now under quiet surveillance, seated like a fragile item that might fracture into violence if left unobserved. Doyle opened a new file on his laptop and began typing. He asked follow-up questions about board memberships, non-documented advisory roles, any angel investment returns, even personal loans that might have contributed to the fund's liquidity. Every query was cloaked in procedure but sharpened by doubt. Omari answered without emotion. His tone was even, his words precise. He didn't embellish. He knew they weren't listening for truth. They were listening for weakness. Somewhere behind them, a junior associate walked past the glass, hesitated, then kept walking. Omari noticed her glance shift toward the room's far corner, the file cabinet. There was a moment, no longer than a breath, when her hand slipped a folder inside a locked drawer, then pocketed the key. It wasn't labeled, but he knew what it was. His file. Being put away. Hidden. Not discarded, just sequestered, sealed from further eyes. When you didn't want a paper trail, you didn't shred. You filed away, under layers of hierarchy where truth dissolved in dust. Doyle finally sat back. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said without inflection. "I've submitted a parallel request for third-party verification. While that is being processed, we ask that you remain on premises. A compliance officer will escort you to a holding lounge." It wasn't a suggestion. The man in the dark suit moved to stand beside Omari, not touching, not speaking, just being. Omari stood calmly. He collected his folder, though there was little left inside. The weight of it had shifted. The documents had been read, passed around, questioned, and now quietly ignored. As they walked, he noticed the receptionist glance up and then quickly look down, tapping something aimlessly on her keyboard. The hallway to the lounge was longer than he remembered. Every step felt slower, heavier, as if the building itself resisted him. He passed a display wall, photos of donors, of executives, of men with square jaws and blue ties, of women with porcelain posture and designer brooches. Not one face looked like his. The door opened into a windowless room with beige walls and 3 armless chairs. No table, no coffee machine, no signal. It was a waiting room by design, but it had the unmistakable silence of a containment space. A monitor blinked softly in the ceiling corner, security grade, angled to cover all corners. The door closed behind him with a soft mechanical click. Omari sat. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt. It had shifted during the walk. Outside the room, he could hear muffled voices, footsteps moving in erratic patterns. Inside, only the soft thrum of forced air and the quiet awareness that he was no longer a guest. Just the sterile hum of air conditioning and the silent weight of being watched. The camera in the corner hadn't blinked. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. Finally, the door clicked and opened. Doyle entered with 2 other individuals. One was the same compliance officer from earlier, now carrying a second folder, and the other a junior assistant who looked nervous before she even stepped through the threshold. Doyle gave Omari a glance that lasted just a second too long. His eyes scanned not just his posture, but his face, his shirt cuffs, his hairline. There was something in that gaze that wasn't administrative. It was evaluative. Like a contractor eyeing a wall for flaws in the plaster. Doyle gestured with a casual wave. "Let's continue this back in Suite 3, he said. "We have some additional notes to walk through." Omari stood without hesitation, following the 3 back down the hall as the door behind them sealed again with a magnetic lock. As they walked past the main corridor, 2 private clients exited a meeting room nearby, both older white men in tailored suits. One nodded at Doyle, who gave a slight grin in return. Omari caught part of the exchange. The man glanced at him, then at Doyle, and said something under his breath. Doyle chuckled and responded with a low tone, "That's what I said. Bit rough around the edges for a portfolio this size." "Huh?" The other man smirked and replied, "Better hope he's not the landscaper." The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Omari heard it all. Every word, every intention. Inside Suite 3 again, Doyle sat first, then slowly unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt like a man settling into comfort. He laid the second folder on the table, but didn't open it right away. Instead, he steepled his fingers and leaned forward, eyes still focused on Omari's face. "We're in a bit of a bind," he began. "A trust like this needs stability, predictability. What we're seeing doesn't align with the typical profile of someone managing this level of wealth. Your documentation checks out, but presentation matters. It's about perception." He gestured with a slow wave, and as he did, he looked directly at Omari's hair, tight curls, natural texture, uncut edges. Then his eyes moved down to Omari's hands, strong, calloused in the palms, nails short but clean. He looked at them the way someone might examine a pair of gloves in the wrong color. "I don't mean to be unkind," Doyle continued, "but appearances often help set expectations. Our more traditional clients have certain expectations of who's sitting at the table when these conversations happen." He turned slightly toward the junior assistant, who had begun organizing a few files near the edge of the desk. Without bothering to lower his voice, Doyle asked, "What would you guess? Construction? Maybe delivery? No, probably warehousing. That's more likely." The girl's hands froze for a second, fingers tensing around a manila envelope. But she said nothing. Her eyes remained on the folder. Omari didn't move. His chest rose and fell slowly, but his hands remained still in his lap. His face betrayed nothing, though every syllable pressed into him like a nail. Doyle leaned back in his chair, exhaling in satisfaction, like the observation had been both clever and correct. He opened the new folder, flipping through 3 pages before pushing them forward. "These are potential compliance flags based on the trust's past investment cycles," he said. "I assume you won't be able to comment directly, but we'll need a general narrative from your end. Something we can present upward." He paused and added, "Of course, it helps if that narrative comes from someone who knows how this world works." The implication hung between them like smoke. Omari reached for the documents, glanced through them silently, and placed them back down. He offered no reaction. He had learned long ago that anger didn't carry weight in rooms like this. Only stillness did. Across the room, the assistant stepped back to the corner, her eyes flickering once toward Omari's shoes, then quickly away. The compliance officer looked mildly bored, as if this meeting had taken longer than necessary. Outside the glass wall, movement continued. A man in a vest carried coffee to a platinum-level client. Someone behind the front desk adjusted their tie in the reflection of a display screen. Everyone else in this place was moving forward, except Omari. Doyle stood again and walked toward the window, arms folded behind his back. There was a slight bounce in his steps now, a rhythm that suggested victory, or at least closure. "You know," he said casually, without turning, "one of our clients overheard part of your intake. He asked if you were representing someone else, or if maybe the documents had been misfiled. It was a polite way of asking whether someone had accidentally given you the wrong chair." He chuckled softly. "Happens more than you'd think. People wander into things that aren't meant for them. Sometimes paperwork gets confused. Sometimes people do." He turned slowly and met Omari's gaze with something resembling a smirk. "But in this business, intent matters. It's not just what you bring, it's whether you know how to carry it." Omari's jaw remained locked. He didn't blink. The line between insult and accusation had long since blurred. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about proximity, about someone like him being too close to something they believed didn't belong to him. Doyle adjusted his cuffs again and moved back to the desk. He clicked his pen once, scribbled something on a legal pad, then said, "We'll call you once we finalize our internal report." A single desk stood at the center, with 2 chairs, one clearly newer than the other. On the table sat a yellowed clipboard holding a paper form and nothing else. No pen, no instruction, no screen, just a hard copy like something passed through time from an era that forgot how to respect precision. Omari approached the desk, studied the form, and took the older chair, which groaned slightly beneath his weight. The document in front of him was titled Client Asset Confirmation Form Manual Verification. He skimmed the first few lines. Name, date of birth, residential address, tax ID, bank account routing numbers, estimated net holdings. Every blank line assumed doubt. Every required answer read like a demand for an explanation, not a verification. There was no keyboard, no tablet, no stylus, not even the standard e-signature pad used for executive clients. Omari reached into his inner jacket pocket, withdrew a pen he always carried, metal-bodied, quiet click, black ink, and placed it beside the form. He didn't touch the paper yet. He waited. The silence inside the room had weight. It wasn't the silence of peace but of protocol, a silence that said this space was created not for service, but separation. After a few minutes, Doyle entered without knocking. He didn't glance at the clipboard. He looked at the pen. "That's not ours," he said, sounding almost surprised. Omari responded without emotion. "You didn't provide one." Doyle offered a bland shrug and stepped toward the wall-mounted panel, where a narrow computer terminal blinked softly in standby. He pressed a few buttons, but the screen didn't change. Instead, he turned it off with a sharp press and muttered something that didn't need to be heard. "We're streamlining resources this quarter. Internal systems are prioritized for primary clients." The words were mechanical, pre-packaged for meetings with shareholders. Omari knew what they really meant. "Not for you." Doyle leaned against the edge of the desk and crossed his arms. He didn't sit. That position was reserved. His eyes flicked from a form to Omari, pausing again on his wristwatch, the same scratched Seiko he had noticed earlier. His lips pressed into a line that hinted at mockery more than judgment. "You'll need to complete this now," he said. "We can't allocate more time to uncertain accounts. You understand there are thresholds, and right now, your profile doesn't cross any of them." Omari nodded once, picked up the pen, and began filling in the form with clean, sharp handwriting. Every motion was measured. There were no corrections, no hesitations, just facts, the kind they kept asking for, the kind they never believed. Doyle remained standing, arms still folded, his eyes drifting toward the security monitor in the corner. From the screen's reflection, Omari could see his own body mirrored faintly. One man completing a form, another observing, without trust. After Omari finished, he flipped the paper neatly and placed it at the center of the desk. Doyle didn't reach for it. Instead, he turned back to the wall panel, hit a single switch, and powered down the last light embedded behind the desk. The overheads remained, but the gesture was symbolic. Session complete. The machine is off. The system is closed. The conversation is over. Without sitting, Doyle spoke again. "We'll process this through secondary channels. Expect delay." He moved toward the door, but stopped before reaching it. His back was to Omari when he added, "You may want to consider making a withdrawal. Smaller accounts are easier to validate. Your case doesn't warrant the attention it's currently receiving." He exited without waiting for a response. The door clicked shut, more final than firm. Omari sat alone again, the single sheet of completed paper resting between his hands. The words he had written felt fragile, as if they'd been set up to be doubted the moment they were scanned. He looked up at the blank wall across from him, where a whiteboard had once been mounted, but now left only faint screw holes in the plaster. Even the ghosts of tools here had been stripped down. A few minutes later, a staff member entered with a neutral expression and a thin blue envelope. She handed it to Omari, said nothing, and left. Inside was a receipt, confirmation of intake non-priority client. The bottom of the page was stamped with the Hallberg and Trenton emblem, but the watermark had faded. This was not a document of prestige. It was a paper trail made deliberately faint. Omari folded it slowly, slid it into his folder, and stood. No one came to escort him back to the lobby. No one said goodbye. He walked down the hallway alone, passing by associates who pretended not to notice him, who busied themselves with calls that didn't exist and files that didn't need moving. He turned the corner and saw the main lobby again, polished floors, curated lighting, laughter from a coffee bar tucked neatly near the window. A banker poured sparkling water into a chilled glass, placed it beside a client who laughed about something trivial. No one looked at Omari. They didn't have to. The message had already been delivered, in forms, in silences, in locked terminals, and missing pens. The city moved around him. Horns blared distantly, briefcases clicked against the concrete, and somewhere above, a jet carved a line through a cloudless sky. Omari sat still. He reached into his wallet, not the one with credit cards and IDs, but a smaller sleeve kept behind the lining, and pulled out a single object. It was a matte gray card the size of a standard business card, but heavier, made of anodized aluminum. It bore no name, no text, no title, only a faintly etched circle in the center, like the ghost of a symbol that refused to be seen unless tilted at the right angle. Omari stared at it for a moment. Then he stood. He returned to the building. He didn't stop at the front desk. He didn't speak. He simply walked back toward the corridor near the east stairwell, turned into the hallway marked services and operations, and stepped into a small staff corridor lined with printers, files, and copy machines. Two associates glanced at him briefly, then resumed their work. No one asked what he was doing there. At the end of the hallway stood a door labeled Print Room 7B. Inside, a single woman operated a multifunction copier the size of a refrigerator. She wore a navy shirt with rolled sleeves and had earbuds tucked into her ears, humming faintly as she sorted paper trays. Omari stepped forward and placed the gray card gently on the counter beside her elbow. He tapped it once, then again, then a third time. She turned immediately, not startled, not confused, just aware. She removed one earbud and looked at the card, her eyes fixed on the faint circle. No questions, no hesitation. Without a word, she stepped away from the machine, wiped her hands on a cloth, and walked out of the room. Omari picked up the card, slid it back into his wallet, and remained where he was. The printer beeped softly behind him. A toner alert, a low tray. Normal life continued. The hallway was quiet, but above him, the building had already started to shift. The woman from print room 7B didn't go back to her station. She didn't return to her desk. She entered the elevator using a magnetic key card not issued to her department. The panel lit up, and instead of pressing floor 4, 5, or 6, the ones where administration and client management operated, she pressed the recessed button marked with only a square. No number, no label. The elevator responded. The ascent was smooth, soundless. Floor 15 was not listed on any staff directory. It didn't need to be. Only 3 people had access to it directly. But when the elevator doors opened, the space beyond was immaculate, minimal, and almost silent. White walls, black stone floors, no art, no logo. A single desk sat at the center, unmanned. Past it stood a frosted glass door with a brass handle. She walked through it. In the boardroom beyond, a meeting had been in session. 7 individuals sat around a long black table, papers spread before them, screens open. None of them looked up as she entered. She approached the head of the table, leaned down, and whispered 3 words into the chairperson's ear. The woman nodded once, slowly, and closed her laptop. One by one, the others followed, shutting down their devices, collecting their folders. No alarms sounded. No meetings were canceled. But something had changed. The print room assistant exited the boardroom and returned to the elevator. Down below, on the main floor, Doyle Whitaker reviewed a client file with a tired expression. The day had stretched longer than expected, and he had just poured himself a glass of room temperature water when his phone buzzed. Not his personal phone, nor his office line, but the silver one mounted to the back corner of his desk, the one marked Internal Executive Relay. He froze. He hadn't seen that phone ring in over 2 years. He picked it up slowly, placed the receiver to his ear, and listened. No introduction, no explanation, only 2 words. Step down. The line went dead. Doyle stared at the receiver for a full 3 seconds, then returned it gently to the cradle. Outside his glass office, the junior assistant glanced at him curiously. Doyle stood, straightened his tie, walked to the filing cabinet, and removed a single black envelope. It contained 1 page, a printed statement of resignation pre-approved, signed in absentia by the board, effective immediately upon invocation. He had filled it out long ago during executive onboarding and had forgotten about it. Until now. Across the floor, whispers had not yet started, but people sensed something. The lights flickered slightly, nothing dramatic, just a 3-beat blink, barely noticeable unless you were looking. Omari was no longer in the print room. He had already left the corridor and returned to the public floor, where he stood calmly by the reception desk. The man without a name tag walked half a pace ahead, never glancing back, never checking to see if Omari followed. He already knew. At the end of a hall, a private lift awaited, one that bypassed public access and required no keycard input. The doors opened before they arrived, as if summoned not by proximity, but by presence. They entered without a word. The elevator ascended in silence. No music, no digital display, just motion and the faint vibration of altitude. When the doors opened again, the room beyond looked nothing like the rest of the bank. This was not a suite for meetings, nor a space designed for show. It was command. The interior resembled a war room more than a boardroom, Wall-length LED displays with live data feeds, ticker scrolls, international markets, fund activity monitors. In the center, a long black table stretched under recessed lighting, surrounded by chairs that whispered exclusivity. A team of 8 already waited, seated and prepared. No one looked surprised to see Omari. No one asked questions. They stood, one by one, and extended hands. "Mr. Ellington, thank you for responding. We appreciate your discretion. You've arrived at the perfect moment." A chair was pulled out for him, at the head of the table. Not one person objected, not even the chairman. What followed was a briefing. Precise, concise. The Ellington Consortium, through a network of shell holdings, parent accounts, and equity partnerships, controlled over $2 billion in diverse assets, and a substantial portion, undisclosed to all but the highest level board, was invested directly into Hallberg and Trenton's high-yield structured bond division. Omari, as the final signature authority of the consortium, held decisive influence over asset retention and reallocation. Not advisory influence, controlling interest. The last transfer logged in their system, a passive note added to their silent ledger 3 months ago, was a series of test withdrawals conducted under anonymity, all triggered by Omari. Quiet probes, observational activity, strategic positioning. The board hadn't been notified until today, because until today, Omari had not activated the internal beacon associated with the circle-etched card. Its presence was rare. It signaled more than a client. It signaled authority. One of the legal officers, seated across the table, opened a leather folder and presented a single page across the table. It contained a short, pre-signed directive: immediate reinstatement of full access and executive visibility, pending asset reassessment. Omari reviewed it, tapped the table once, and nodded. That was enough. Across the building, notifications began to shift. Lights dimmed slightly as the building's internal mode changed from standard operations to executive override. On the 21st floor, a backup generator tested its feed lines, not for emergency, but readiness. The systems didn't know why, but the people did. Downstairs, Doyle sat in his office, sipping from a now lukewarm glass of water, staring blankly at a screen that no longer responded to input. His access had been silently suspended, his calendar replaced by a gray block of unassigned time. The moment crystallized when the director of regional oversight entered through the main doors, followed by 2 members of a legal advisory team and the senior risk analyst for capital accounts. They didn't speak to the receptionist. They didn't even slow down. They moved in a line toward Suite 3. When they passed Doyle's office, not one of them looked inside. The door remained open. His presence was acknowledged with silence, the most brutal dismissal of all. Omari entered the suite moments later, not flanked by security, but accompanied by presence. He stepped into the room as if it had always belonged to him. The financial risk officer extended a hand immediately. "Mr. Ellington, we're here to offer our apology for what occurred earlier. This does not reflect the values of our firm, nor does it align with the standards expected of our team." The words were rehearsed, but not hollow. Behind them, employees stood still, watching, learning, recalibrating their understanding of what had just taken place. The man they had dismissed as out of place now stood at the center of the institution they thought they understood. One of the younger associates at the edge of the room stepped forward with a tablet, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly as she offered it. "Please let us know if there's anything you need corrected in your portfolio, sir." Doyle still hadn't moved. The hum of the air conditioner seemed louder now, a dull mechanical drone that no longer covered his thoughts. He watched through the glass as Omari accepted the tablet, tapped once, and handed it back. The screen displayed one line: holdings confirmed. Transfer pending. The associate blinked, looked at the legal officer, who nodded once. No hesitation. No chain of command delays. Everything had already shifted. The weight of decision no longer belonged to the people who had built walls between themselves and men like Omari. Now those walls belonged to him. As Omari turned slightly, his eyes passed briefly over Doyle, just once. No anger, no smile, just a brief moment of recognition, and then dismissal. The kind of dismissal that stung deeper than any insult. A choice to forget. That kind of disappearance didn't require explanation. It was cleaner than confrontation. But silence, when broken, has a way of echoing. It started with a leak. A junior compliance officer, anonymous and invisible, uploaded a snippet of internal security footage to a whistleblower inbox hosted by a local financial ethics nonprofit. The clip showed a grainy time-stamped view of Suite 3. Doyle stood over a seated Omari, his arms crossed, his mouth moving. The words weren't audible, but the body language said enough. The facial expressions, the posture, the dismissiveness, the gesture toward the window, the narrowed eyes, the smirk. A second clip followed 2 hours later from the waiting area camera. It showed Omari being led to the steel chair near the restroom hallway. It showed the cleaning crew moving in before he had even stood up. The footage was raw. It was unsensational. And it was damning. Within 36 hours, the nonprofit released a statement. Institutional bias caught in routine procedure. It didn't name names. It didn't need to. Viewers recognized the building, the emblem on the receptionist screen, the unique blue of Hallberg and Trenton's document folders. People started asking questions. The media picked it up on the third day. Not a scandal. Not yet. Just a story. A case study in behavior. A quiet expose titled, "Who Decides Who Belongs?" The article ran in a financial blog with modest reach. Then it spread. A week later, 2 major publications ran features with enhanced footage, transcribed interviews from internal sources, and a growing list of procedural irregularities that painted a very clear picture. Omari Ellington, a man with controlling interest in one of the firm's largest investment partners, had been subjected to invasive verification, visible humiliation, and negligent discrimination under the direct oversight of regional manager Doyle Whitaker. The article included a single frame, Omari seated with his folder, hands folded, while Doyle loomed above. No caption, just contrast. Then the headlines came. A whisper first, then a roar. Financial Times, Bloomberg, Tech Equity Journal, and a dozen others followed suit. Omari never gave a direct interview. He didn't need to. The story didn't need embellishment. It was already perfect in its brutality. Professional bias wrapped in protocol. Disrespect delivered through systems. Arrogance justified by assumption. The public didn't rage. They reflected. The quiet professionals. The underrepresented clients. The corporate employees who'd learned how to navigate in dignity by dressing it in patience. Everyone saw themselves in Omari, and they weren't angry for him. They were angry because of him. The consequence was slow at first. Doyle received a call from the State Banking Commission. A review of his licensure had been triggered under Article 11B, misuse of authority and violation of non-discrimination statutes. His credentials were frozen. His pending arbitration cases paused. His legal protections thin. He contacted legal counsel. The answer was brief. You're not being defended. The bank had waived internal protections. You're exposed. You're the variable they can afford to lose. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't sleep. Over the next week, 3 civil rights organizations filed joint claims against Hallberg and Trenton. They named Doyle specifically in the filing. They used transcripts, video evidence, and corroborated testimony from 5 employees, 2 of whom had resigned before the story broke, but cited patterns of behavior that now painted a larger, systemic narrative. On the 10th day, a digital ethics conference listed Omari as a keynote speaker for their Justice in Finance panel. The announcement was minimal. A name, a title, a line, "We do not need to demand inclusion. We are inclusion." The line trended for 8 hours. Then came the protest. Not loud, not violent, but coordinated. Dozens of former clients withdrew accounts. A coordinated memo circulated online, an open letter titled "The Weight of Bias," signed by CEOs, educators, and public servants who demanded institutional accountability. They didn't want blood. They wanted exposure. Truth laid bare without defense. Inside his apartment, Doyle stared at a news segment playing on mute. The anchor's lips moved rhythmically beside a still image of Suite 3. He hadn't turned off the screen in hours. A knock at the door came mid-afternoon. A courier. An envelope. Inside, official notification from the National Financial Ethics Board. His professional license was revoked pending permanent disqualification. A second document followed the next day. Notice of contract severance from Hallberg and Trenton, effective retroactively. No severance. No benefits. Just one line. Your services are no longer aligned with our mission. Doyle read the sentence 4 times. Then he dropped the page on the floor. Across town, Omari met with a group of silent investors in a room with no logo on the wall. He wasn't there to retaliate. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there to reallocate. The weeks passed without fanfare. Public interest drifted to new controversies. Headlines faded. Online threads slowed to a stop. But inside the silence, a different kind of story continued, unreported, unshared. Doyle Whitaker no longer occupied corner offices or appeared on panel discussions. The suits were gone, replaced by simple shirts and a watch that no longer told time in gold. His name, once printed on quarterly reports and internal memoranda, had vanished from corporate memory. But he hadn't disappeared. He had relocated, not geographically, but internally. He arrived at the community building at 7:30 every morning, 15 minutes before the doors opened, and waited outside on the steps. He didn't ask for keys. He didn't sit behind a desk. He came with a notebook, a pen, and a quiet willingness that didn't beg to be seen. The nonprofit's name was painted in fading blue on the door, the Framework Initiative, Minority Business Resource Center. Inside were second-hand chairs, coffee brewed from donated grounds, and walls covered in project sketches taped up with masking tape. No branding, no budgets, just people building something from almost nothing. Doyle didn't speak much the first few days. He sat in on workshops about small business incorporation, about credit literacy, about supply chain resilience. He offered to clean up after meetings. He carried boxes. He took notes. Slowly, someone handed him a spreadsheet to review, then a grant proposal, then a mentorship form for a student who needed help formalizing a vending business. He corrected the margins, adjusted the tone, tightened the language. When asked, he explained why certain phrasing mattered, why banks looked for certain ratios, why tone made a difference. The others listened, not because of who he had been, but because of how he now listened in return. His advice was never loud, never titled, just shared. The director of the initiative, an older woman named Sylvia, had no formal finance training, but she knew people, and she knew stories. She watched Doyle carefully, not with suspicion, but with awareness. On the 14th day, she walked up behind him while he retyped an executive summary and said, "People don't come here unless they've lost something." Doyle paused, then replied, "Maybe some of us come here hoping to earn what we never deserved in the first place." She nodded. "That's a start." 2 weeks later, the organization received a plain envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a typed letter and a single check. The note read, "I would ask that this contribution remain unnamed. I believe in your mission. I believe in accountability. And I believe in reconstruction, not of systems, but of people." Attached to the letter was a recommendation. It proposed that Mr. Doyle Whitaker be considered for an intensive community mentorship pilot under the supervision of the board and subject to quarterly evaluation. It was signed only with an initial, E. Sylvia read it 3 times. She didn't ask who sent it. She didn't need to. The handwriting on the signature line was unmistakable, clean, minimalist, exact. Omari Ellington hadn't spoken to Doyle since the day their roles reversed. He hadn't emailed. He hadn't confronted. But he had seen. He had noticed. And he had chosen not to punish further, but to extend a shape of grace that did not excuse, only invited transformation. The program was approved. Doyle began showing up for longer hours. He met with first-time entrepreneurs who were unsure how to read contracts. He helped translate financial jargon into plain terms. He never offered answers, only paths. And when asked why he volunteered, he said, "I'm learning how to hear what I used to speak over." The days stretched into months. The nonprofit expanded. Word spread, not about Doyle, but about the work. The quiet kind. The kind done without microphones or closing bells. Doyle's name never returned to headlines, but it appeared quietly in footnotes of grant reports, in the acknowledgments of small business filings, and in the handwritten thank you notes taped above the coffee station. One afternoon, as winter crept into the city, Omari walked past the building on his way to another meeting across town. He didn't go in. He didn't stop. But through the window, he saw Doyle seated beside a young woman pointing at a spreadsheet, explaining inventory turnover in patient, unhurried sentences. There was no recognition between them, no nod, no gesture, just a shared silence that stretched across the glass, holding neither pride nor shame, only acknowledgement. Omari walked on. His path didn't bend. His pace didn't slow. He had not come for closure. He had given it, and Doyle had chosen to carry it. In the end, there were no dramatic apologies, no redemption arcs told for sympathy, no platforms offered to clean reputations. Just two men, once divided by assumption, now moving in parallel along quieter lines, one building, the other rebuilding, in a world trained to reward spectacle. This was the ending no one noticed. And yet, it was the only one that ever mattered. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to support more powerful narratives like this one. We want to hear from you. What part of the story hit hardest for you? Which moment stuck with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a real conversation.